The story you are about to know is not just an account of injustice. It is a journey of faith, pain, and redemption. In a world where the truth can be buried by well-told lies, it sometimes takes a miracle to bring to light what has been hidden. Emily was an ordinary woman, living a simple life until the day it all fell apart. Sitting in a cold cell, shrouded in shadows and silence, she could not understand how fate had been so cruel. Her life changed overnight when she was accused of a terrible crime. Condemned to the electric chair, Emily became a symbol of despair and helplessness as society watched the spectacle of her downfall. The outside world judged her harshly. Sensationalist headlines plastered his face, and opinions were formed even before any concrete evidence was presented. To many, Emily was nothing more than a monster, a face associated with the heinous crime that shook the community. However, behind the accusations and the conviction, there was a truth that few were willing to hear. In her cell, Emily struggled daily with the temptation to give up. The weight of loneliness was overwhelming, and silence became an unrelenting companion. But even in the midst of darkness, there was a spark of hope. That fragile flame came from his faith, something he refused to let go. As the days passed and the clock neared the final moment, Emily began to reflect on her life, her choices, and the events that led her there. Not far away, an entire community was divided between those who cried out for justice and others who silently questioned the veracity of the accusations. The few who still believed in Emily's innocence faced a sea of doubt and hostility. But amid the outside noise, what really mattered was what was going on inside Emily. On the day she was first ushered into court, Emily's gaze crossed with that of the judge who would seal her fate. The man seemed unshakable, a pillar of authority. However, behind that rigid façade, there were secrets that would slowly begin to emerge, like cracks in a wall that appeared to be solid. As her story unfolds, Emily will find strength where she least expects it, and in the darkest moment of her life, her final words will bring not only redemption to herself, but also a transformation that no one could have predicted. This is the beginning of a journey that reminds us that even in the most desperate circumstances, faith can be the light that illuminates the darkest paths. The cold light of the courtroom reflected on the tense faces of the people present. Emily was sitting next to her lawyer, her gaze fixed on an invisible spot on the floor. Around her, a sea of judgmental eyes watched her, each carrying a silent sentence. The room was packed with reporters looking for headlines and curious citizens eager for justice. The accusations against Emily were serious. She was being held responsible for a crime that deeply shook the city, the disappearance and alleged murder of a 5-year-old child, Charlotte, daughter of a respected local businessman, James Whitman. From the beginning, the investigation was marked by flaws, but public pressure and media influence turned Emily into the perfect target. The prosecutor, an articulate man named Alan Thompson, spared no effort to paint Emily as a cruel and calculating figure. He used a combination of circumstantial evidence and dubious testimony to bolster his narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said fervently, "here is a woman who has destroyed an entire family. Charlotte trusted her. Emily abused that trust in the most despicable way." Defense attorney Peter Sullivan struggled to find loopholes in the case. "We don't have hard evidence," he argued. "All we have are assumptions and the need to blame someone quickly." But despite her efforts, the tide was clearly against Emily. The witnesses called by the prosecution did not help at all. A neighbor whose memory was notoriously flawed claimed to have seen Emily with the girl on the day of her disappearance. A co-worker mentioned that Emily seemed to be nervous that week, which was interpreted as a sign of guilt. But the most damaging piece presented by the prosecutor was a toy of Charlotte's found in Emily's home. Although there was no evidence that Emily had put him there, the discovery was enough to convince the jury of his alleged connection to the crime. The media played a crucial role in this process. Days before the trial, Local newspapers had already printed headlines such as "Monster Among Us" and "Emily Parker, the Face of Evil." Sensationalist reports flooded the city's homes, shaping public opinion against it. The anchors of the major television networks discussed the case in a serious tone, condemning Emily even before the deliberations began. As the trial unfolded, Emily remained quiet, as if accepting her fate. But in his mind, chaos reigned. She knew that every word spoken against her was a distortion of the truth, but she felt powerless to fight them. At each courtroom session, Justice William Cooper's harsh words echoed like hammers into his soul. He was known for his rigidity and for being inflexible in cases of crimes against children. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said in his firm voice, "you have before you an immense responsibility. They must decide whether this woman is guilty of one of the most abominable crimes imaginable. After weeks of testimony, heated discussions, and emotional courtroom displays, the time has come for the verdict." Emily was told to stand while the head of the jury read the decision. The silence in the room was deafening, the kind of silence that precedes the inevitable. Guilty culpata. The impact of the word hit Emily like an icy wave. She stood firm, but inside, everything fell apart. Discreet tears streamed down his mother's face, sitting in the front row as Peter Sullivan bowed his head in defeat. The sentence was announced soon after: death by electric chair. To the court, Emily was now a convicted murderer. For the city, she was an example of justice done. Emily's conviction not only marked her life, but also left deep scars on the community. The case divided opinions and destroyed TIs. Some people, even without knowing her, felt that something was wrong in the process. Others celebrated what they considered a triumph of justice. Emily was taken back to prison to await her execution. The days that followed were marked by reflections and unanswered questions. How could an innocent woman be a victim of such a flawed system? And more importantly, is there still a chance for the truth to prevail? But what no one knew was that Emily's days were far from ending in silence. Something bigger was about to happen, something that would change the course of his life and that of everyone around him. The nights in prison were long, shrouded in a darkness that seemed to reflect the emotional abyss in which Emily was plunged. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the metallic sound of doors closing or the distant echo of footsteps through the corridors. There, in the solitary confinement of her cell, Emily experienced pain that went beyond the physical. It was an agony of the soul, a constant battle against despair. As the days passed, the routine in prison became almost unbearable. Waking up, eating, going back to the cell, waiting. Every move was monitored. Every interaction was impersonal. Emily felt like a shadow of herself, her identity gradually being eroded by the system that had condemned her. But even there, in that hostile environment, she still clung to something greater: faith. Deep in her heart, Emily believed that the truth would one day prevail. Yet faith sometimes seemed as far away as freedom. There were times when she wondered if God was listening to her prayers, if he really had a plan for her life. But then, something inside her whispered, "Don't give up." Her cell was small and cold, but Emily began to turn it into a place of introspection. She spent hours reflecting on her life, her choices, and the events that led her there. The walls of the cell, covered with small cracks, looked like mirrors that reflected the fragments of his soul. Her mother's letters were a small relief in the midst of suffering. They arrived on time with words of encouragement and prayers. "Never lose faith," said one. "We're fighting for you out here." These words, as simple as they were, had a profound impact on Emily, renewing her strength to face another day. There was also the prison chaplain, Reverend Thomas, who occasionally visited Emily. His presence was serene, almost comforting. He never forced conversations, but offered his company and prayers. "God doesn't abandon anyone, Emily," he said softly. Even in the darkest moments, he is with you, despite the temporary consolation. The weight of the condemnation was constant. The clock seemed relentless, each ticking bringing Emily closer to her final destination. As the day of execution approached, fear began to creep in, challenging his faith. There was an internal struggle between believing in the miracle and accepting the inevitable. One night, Emily had a dream that marked her deeply. In the dream, she was in a vast field, surrounded by light. An indistinct but comforting figure approached and said, "The truth will be your light, and it will shine at the right time." When he woke up, he felt a momentary peace, as if he had received a divine message. This dream was a turning point in his emotional journey. Although the reality around her had not changed, something inside her was beginning to strengthen. Emily decided that even if her voice was ignored, she would never stop proclaiming her innocence. The physical isolation in prison was cruel, but the emotional isolation was even more devastating. Emily knew that most people had already convicted her in the court of public opinion. However, she began to find comfort in her prayers. Each night before going to sleep, she would recite psalms and give herself over to the hope that somehow her suffering would have a greater purpose. The prison guards, while professional, could not fully conceal their compassion. One of them, Jack, once said to Emily, "I don't know if you're guilty or innocent, but you have more strength than a lot of free people out there." These words stayed with her, reinforcing her determination to keep fighting, even when all seemed lost. Gradually, Emily began to realize that her suffering was not in vain. He was shaping her, strengthening her faith, and clarifying her vision of what really mattered. She knew that her story would not end within those cold walls. Something bigger was at stake, something that would only be revealed at the right time. However, what Emily didn't know was what forces were moving outside the prison. The silence inside his cell would soon be interrupted by events that would defy all logic. His story was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted, and the truth, as in his dream, would finally begin to shine. The night before Emily's execution was charged with tension and an almost deafening silence. The sound of the chains dragged by the guards, the distant murmurs, and the clinking of keys seemed amplified. Emily sat on the small bench in her cell, her eyes fixed on the wooden crucifix that Chaplain Thomas had left on his last visit. She knew that this could be her last dawn. The chaplain's words still echoed in his mind. "Emily, the path may be dark, but remember that light always finds a way to shine." Even in the deepest darkness, when the first rays of sunlight pierced the bars of the cell, the guards came to pick her up. "Emily Parker," Jack called, in a voice that tried to hide his emotion. "It's time." She stood up slowly, her heart heavy but her legs steady. There was an unexpected calm about her, as if an unseen force was sustaining her. Led down the long hallway to the execution room, Emily felt the piercing gazes of the spectators, who crowded to watch this final moment. The room was lit by a cold, clinical light, with chairs arranged in orderly rows. Among the crowd, she noticed familiar faces: reporters, lawyers, jury members, and sitting in the front row, Judge William Cooper himself. Emily was strapped to the electric chair with mechanical precision. As technicians adjusted the electrodes, the silence in the room was cut only by the subtle hum of the equipment. The officer in charge approached and, in a formal tone, asked, "Do you have anything to say before the sentence is carried out?" The question hung in the air, and all eyes turned to Emily. Most expected her to remain silent, accepting the fate that had been imposed on her. But then, to everyone's surprise, Emily raised her head and looked directly at the audience. "Yes," she said, in a calm, steady voice. "I have something to say." A murmur ran through the room. Emily took a deep breath, her gaze meeting Judge Cooper's. "I'm innocent," she began. "And today, even if you choose to take my life, the truth will not be buried with me." His voice, initially serene, began to carry an increasing intensity. "Justice has not been served here. You condemned me based on lies, but let me say this. God knows the truth, and it will come out at the right time." The impact of his words was immediate. The crowd, which had previously seemed thirsty for justice, now listened in uneasy silence. Some looked away, while others, clearly shaken, exchanged worried looks. Emily then turned her gaze to the judge. "You know, and I know, that this case was never about Charlotte. It was about protecting secrets, manipulating narratives. But the truth cannot be silenced forever. It is like light, it can be blocked, but it always finds a way." The judge, who until then had kept an impassive expression, began to show signs of discomfort. He avoided looking directly at Emily, his fingers drumming nervously in the chair. When Emily finished, the officer hesitated for a moment, as if pondering whether he should proceed. But before he could give the final command, a sound of rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway. Suddenly, the doors swung open, and an authoritarian voice interrupted the tension. "Stop this execution." All eyes turned to the entrance, where a young lawyer, visibly agitated, held an envelope. "New evidence has been discovered," he declared, his voice trembling with urgency. "We cannot allow this woman to be executed." Judge Cooper tried to maintain control of the situation. "What evidence?" he asked, his voice now charged with nervousness. The lawyer advanced, handing the envelope to the judge. Inside were documents that revealed startling details, inconsistencies in witness testimony, manipulated evidence, and a confession written by a key witness admitting that she had been coerced into lying in court. The room erupted in murmurs. The judge, now visibly pale, read the documents with wide eyes. He looked at Emily, then at the officer, and finally said, "Stop the execution immediately." The relief was palpable. Emily, still tied to the chair, felt her legs weaken with emotion. The tears came uncontrollably, not from fear, but from a deep gratitude. She knew something bigger had happened there. As the guards freed her, Chaplain Thomas appeared in the room with a look of joy and reverence. "I told you the light would find a way," he whispered to Emily. The execution room, once a symbol of despair, has become a place of transformation. Emily, a woman scarred by injustice, was now at the center of a miracle that would change her life forever. News of Emily's stay of execution spread quickly, breaking through the prison walls and echoing through the city. News reports, which had previously painted her as an irredeemable criminal, now carried surprise-laden headlines. "Execution halted. New evidence emerges in Parker case." Emily, still shaken by the events in the execution room, was taken back to her cell. But this time, something had changed. The chains that seemed to weigh on her were no longer so oppressive. The air that once seemed to suffocate her now held a promise of freedom. The next day, an emergency hearing was called to review the new evidence. The courtroom was crowded again, but the mood was different. The buzz of curiosity and indignation gave way to an atmosphere of suspense and uncertainty. Everyone was eager to understand what had really happened. The young lawyer who stopped the execution, Nathan Blake, presented the new evidence to the court. He began by detailing the inconsistencies in the witness statements, showing how some contradictions had been ignored in the original trial. "These failures can no longer be dismissed as mere mistakes," he said firmly. He then presented the written confession of one of the key witnesses, a woman named Margaret Henson. Margaret admitted to lying under pressure, fearing reprisals if she did not follow the instructions given to her. "I was coerced into saying that I saw Emily near Charlotte's house on the day of the disappearance," she wrote. "But that's not true. I never saw her that day." The court fell silent as Judge Cooper read the confession aloud. His voice wavered, a shadow of concern evident in his countenance. Everyone's eyes were on him, waiting for a reaction. But Nathan Blake wasn't done yet. He revealed that there was a crucial piece of evidence never before presented: phone records that placed Emily in a completely different location at the time of Charlotte's disappearance. This evidence had somehow been lost during the initial investigation. "This evidence has been deliberately suppressed," Blake said. "And this not only compromises the integrity of the case, but also demonstrates an intentional effort to incriminate Emily." Nathan's words caused a shock in the room. Murmurs erupted among the spectators. Some members of the original jury, present to witness the review, looked nervously at each other, while others looked completely devastated. Emily, sitting next to Nathan, felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief at finally seeing the truth emerge, and anger at all that he had lost because of such an elaborate lie. However, the most dramatic moment was yet to come. The lawyer presented a final document, a record of messages exchanged between James Whitman, Charlotte's father, and a detective involved in the case. The messages indicated that Whitman, desperate to find a culprit and save his reputation, had directly influenced the investigation. These revelations were a devastating blow to the case against Emily. Prosecutor Alan Thompson, who had previously bragged about the conviction, was now visibly cornered. He tried to defend himself, stating that he had trusted the information provided to him, but his words rang hollow. When Nathan Blake finished his presentation, he looked directly at Judge Cooper. "Mr. Judge, this woman spent months waiting for her death, carrying the weight of a crime she did not commit. Justice can no longer be delayed." The judge, now clearly shaken, announced that he needed time to deliberate. The room was temporarily emptied, and Emily returned to her cell. However, this time, she felt a spark of hope, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hours later, the court was recalled. Judge Cooper, with a grave expression, declared that, in light of the new evidence, Emily Parker's conviction would be overturned. The sound of the hammer resounded, marking the end of a brutal injustice. The room erupted in murmurs, and then in applause. Emily, with tears in her eyes, looked at Nathan and whispered, "Thank you," while being officially declared innocent. Emily knew that her fight had not only been for herself, but also for all those who had suffered unjustly at the hands of a flawed system. His story would now be a symbol of hope and a powerful reminder that the truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to emerge. The days following Emily's release were a whirlwind of emotions. The sun seemed brighter, the air lighter, but the reality of everything that had happened still weighed on his mind. Despite being physically free, Emily knew that true freedom would only come with the reunion she longed for. His first night out of prison was spent in a small hotel, arranged by Nathan Blake. She could barely sleep, not because the environment was uncomfortable, but because her mind was occupied with thoughts about Charlotte. The missing girl, who had been the center of all that tragedy, was still somewhere. Emily's case had been closed, but the search for Charlotte was far from over. The next morning, Emily was greeted by her mother, Sarah, who was waiting for her with a tight hug and uncontained tears. "I knew this day would come," Sarah said, between sobs. "You've never been alone." By Sarah's side was her younger sister, Claire, who also fought tirelessly for her release. "Now that you're here, we can start healing," Claire said, her voice full of determination. Emily spent the first few days at home recovering, but she knew she couldn't remain silent. His story, which had captured the attention of the entire nation, needed to be told. She decided to give an exclusive interview, not to relive the trauma, but to thank those who believed in her and to highlight the importance of truth and justice. In the interview, Emily spoke candidly about her journey. "The whole time I was in prison," she said, "I clung to the hope that one day I would see my family again. But what kept me going was the certainty that, somewhere, the truth was waiting to be discovered. But there was one issue that Emily still couldn't solve on her own: Charlotte's whereabouts." In a private conversation with Nathan, she expressed her concern. "I can't rest completely until I know what happened to Charlotte," she said. My freedom is not complete while this child is still missing. Nathan, who also felt responsible for finding answers, promised to continue investigating. We will not stop until the full truth comes out, he said. It was then that an unexpected clue emerged. A woman named Eleanor, who had worked as a nanny for the Whitman family, contacted Nathan. She claimed to have information that could change the course of the investigations. According to Eleanor, in the months leading up to Charlotte's disappearance, James Whitman demonstrated increasingly erratic and controlling behavior. Eleanor said that she once overheard a heated conversation between James and an unknown man. You can't let that out, the man said. Everything we build will be in danger, although at the time, she did not understand the context. Eleanor now believed that this conversation was related to Charlotte's disappearance. With this new information, Nathan and Emily decided to visit Eleanor. The woman's home, located in a quiet neighborhood, was filled with old photos and memorabilia. I should have spoken sooner, Eleanor said, her eyes full of guilt. But I was afraid of James. He was always an influential man. Eleanor revealed that after Charlotte's disappearance, James visited a close friend's house in a rural area. She believed that he might have hidden the girl there to protect her from something or someone. The revelation brought a new wave of hope to Emily. With the help of the authorities, a search was initiated at the property mentioned by Eleanor. The site, a secluded ranch surrounded by dense forests, seemed like the perfect place to hide someone. Emily couldn't contain her anxiety as she watched the officers search the area. After hours of searching, one of the officers approached Emily and Nathan with a serious expression. We found something, he said. Emily was led to a small cabin at the back of the property. There, to her surprise, she saw a blonde-haired girl sitting on a chair, playing with a doll. It was Charlotte. Her eyes lit up as she saw the strangers enter, but she didn't look frightened. Charlotte, Emily called softly, her tears already flowing. The girl looked at her, a little confused, but not hostile. The moment was captured by cameras of journalists who were following the search. The image of Emily kneeling before Charlotte, holding her hands tenderly, became a symbol of redemption and hope. Although Charlotte was still too young to fully comprehend what had happened, Emily knew that in time, the truth would be revealed to her. The important thing was that the girl was safe and finally returning home. Emily's reunion with Charlotte marked the beginning of a new chapter, not only for them, but for everyone involved. The city that once condemned her now welcomed her as a heroine, someone who never gave up fighting for justice. With the case closed and Charlotte finally safe, Emily began to rebuild her life. But the journey wasn't just about taking back control. It was also about understanding what her experience meant in a larger context. His time in prison, facing loneliness and despair, had planted seeds of wisdom that now blossomed into valuable lessons. In the weeks following her reunion with freedom, Emily spent long hours reflecting on the events that shaped her. She used to sit in the garden of her mother's house, watching the flowers sway gently in the wind. For her, each petal was a symbol of resilience and renewal. During these reflections, Emily recognized that her story went beyond a simple narrative of injustice. It was a testament to the power of faith, inner strength, and the importance of never giving up, even when all seems lost. I wasn't just the victim of a flawed system, she once told Claire. I was called to go through this ordeal to understand how much truth and hope can transform lives. Emily began to write a journal, recording every emotion and thought that arose. Her words flowed like a river, documenting not only the pain she had endured, but also the moments of clarity and growth. This diary would later become the basis for a book, which she titled Light in the Darkness. With Nathan's help, Emily began to share her story at lectures and community events. His goal was not only to share what he had experienced, but also to inspire others to seek justice and keep their faith in difficult times. Every time she went on stage, she felt a mixture of nervousness and purpose. In one of these talks, Emily spoke directly to a group of young people. You may not face the same struggles as I do, but each of you will have moments when life will seem unbearable. Remember this, within you, there is a force greater than any obstacle. And when you tap into that force, no injustice or challenge can defeat you. The impact of these words was immediate. After the lecture, several people approached Emily to share their own stories of struggle and overcoming. She listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and reassuring her that even in the worst of circumstances, there is always a way forward. However, Emily's reflections were not limited to what she had learned about herself. She also pondered the judicial system and the many others who, like her, might be unjustly imprisoned. My story had a happy ending, she thought, but how many are still waiting for justice? This concern has led her to collaborate with organizations dedicated to reviewing court cases. Along with Nathan and other lawyers, she began working on cases of wrongfully convicted people, using her experience to bring a more humane and compassionate eye to the legal process. During an interview, Emily was asked what else she learned from her ordeal. She smiled slightly before replying, I learned that suffering doesn't have to be the end of our story. It can be the soil where we plant the seeds of something greater. And above all, I learned that truth has a power that no lie can suppress. This perspective resonated deeply with his audience. Emily not only overcame her own struggles, but also became a guide for those seeking strength in their own battles. However, she also recognized the importance of balancing her new mission with moments of peace and personal connection. In her spare time, Emily devoted herself to spending time with Charlotte and her family. Charlotte's every smile, every moment shared, was a reminder of the beauty that could come after the storm. These simple moments, such as playing in the park or quiet evenings reading bedtime stories, were just as valuable as the big speeches and public events. They were a silent testimony that despite all that had been lost, there was still much to be appreciated and celebrated. Ultimately, Emily understood that her journey was not only a search for justice, but also a deep exploration of her own humanity. She found purpose in connecting with others, striving for change, and appreciating the small joys in life. Her story not only changed her own life, but touched the hearts of thousands, turning pain into inspiration and darkness into light. As Emily delved deeper into the new phase of her life, she began to realize the central role that faith played in her survival. During the darkest days in prison, when there seemed to be no way out, it was her spiritual connection that sustained her. Now in freedom, Emily was determined to share this experience more broadly, exploring how faith can be a transformative force in any circumstance. Emily began attending community meetings in churches and spiritual support centers. At one such gathering, hosted by the Rev. Thomas, the chaplain who accompanied her to prison, she spoke about how faith had been her anchor. There were times when my mind would tell me to give up, she confessed. But it was in those moments that I turned to prayer and found strength that I didn't even know I had. Reverend Thomas also shared his perspective. He highlighted how, even in the midst of the chaos, Emily's faith remained unwavering, serving as an example for other prisoners. Emily not only survived injustice, he said, she transcended it, showing that true faith does not depend on external circumstances, but on an internal, deep connection with God to reinforce this message. Emily began interviewing people who, like her, had faced extreme adversity and found solace in spirituality. In his conversations, he heard stories of people who overcame terminal illnesses, family losses, and social injustices, all sustained by the strength of their faith. One such story came from Martha, a woman who had lost everything in a fire, but who found renewal by getting involved in community and spiritual projects. Faith didn't give me everything I wanted, Martha said, but it gave me everything I needed to move forward. Emily realized that these stories, when put together, could inspire many others. She began working on a new initiative, a documentary titled Paths of Faith, which would explore how spirituality transforms lives. The project quickly gained support, attracting experts and religious leaders who were eager to share their perspectives. The documentary was structured in 3 parts. In the first, he explored the personal impact of faith, highlighting stories such as that of Emily and Martha. In the second, it examined the role of faith in communities, showing how it brought people together in times of crisis. And in the third, he discussed the broader dimension of faith as a catalyst for social change, addressing issues of justice and equality. During filming, Emily met with theologians and psychologists who explained how faith can strengthen emotional and mental resilience. Believing in something greater than ourselves, explained Dr. Samuel Clark, a renowned psychologist, gives us a purpose that transcends immediate suffering. This allows us to find meaning in even the most difficult experiences. The impact of Kaminhas DF was immediate. When the documentary was released, it received praise not only from religious audiences, but also from critics and skeptics who were surprised by the honest and inclusive approach to the topic. Emily was invited to participate in several television shows and podcasts where she discussed the transformative power of faith and how it had shaped her personal journey. In addition, Emily continued her work on injustice cases, now with an even deeper approach. She believed that justice was not only a legal concept, but also a spiritual principle. Seeking justice, she said, is a way of manifesting faith in the greater good. One of the most notable initiatives was the creation of a fund to support wrongfully convicted prisoners, with a focus on offering spiritual and legal assistance. The fund, called Light of Hope, quickly gained prominence, attracting donations and volunteers from all over the country. Emily and her team worked tirelessly to ensure that others did not face the same fate as her. At one of the fundraisers, Emily took the stage to talk about the importance of keeping hope alive. Faith isn't just about believing in something you can't see, she said. It's trusting that even when all seems lost, there's a greater purpose at play. That's what kept me going, and that's what can keep any of you going hard, no matter what you're up against. His speeches often ended with moments of silence and reflection, allowing the audience to process the depth of his words. People of all ages and backgrounds came to her, sharing how their own struggles had been illuminated by Emily's message. In the years since, Emily has become a leading voice at the intersection of spirituality and social justice. Not only has his work brought solace to many, but it has also inspired concrete changes in policies and attitudes. Despite all this, Emily never lost her humility. "I am only a witness," she said, living proof that faith can transform even the most impossible situations. Emily Parker's story has not only touched hearts, but also sparked deep discussions about the flaws of the judicial system. Her acquittal, after months on death row, raised a crucial question. How many other Emily Parkers could be unjustly imprisoned, awaiting a cruel fate? With the support of Nathan Blake and several organizations, Emily began to use her platform to advocate for systemic reforms. She firmly believed that her experience should serve as a catalyst for change. "My freedom is not the end of this fight," she said in interviews. "It's the beginning of a movement to make sure that no one else goes through what I went through. The first step was to create a detailed report on the failures in your own case." This document was presented to judicial commissions and legislators, highlighting points such as the manipulation of evidence, the influence of the media, and the coercion of witnesses. The aim was not only to expose the errors, but also to propose concrete solutions, such as greater oversight in investigations and protection for vulnerable witnesses. In addition, Emily participated in several public hearings where she shared her testimony with lawmakers. In one of these meetings, she said, "The system failed me, but it can be fixed. What we need is transparency, accountability, and compassion." His words were met with applause and opened doors for broader discussions. One of the proposed reforms was the creation of an independent unit to review cases of possible miscarriages of justice. This unit, made up of lawyers, investigators, and human rights experts, would have the task of re-examining controversial convictions. Emily was invited to be part of the advisory board of this new entity, a role she accepted with a great sense of responsibility. Meanwhile, his story continued to reverberate in the media and on social media. Documentaries, articles, and television programs explored not only Emily's case, but also the broader impact of systemic injustice. On one of these programs, the host made the following observation: Emily Parker is not only an example of survival, but a beacon of change in a system that is in dire need of reform. Emily's influence also extended to the field of education. Universities began to include his case in law and criminology courses as an example of a miscarriage of justice that could have been avoided. She was invited to speak at renowned institutions, where she inspired a new generation of lawyers to seek not only the application of the law, but true justice. One of the most remarkable moments of her journey was a visit to Congress, where she was received by a Human Rights Commission. Emily used this opportunity to highlight the importance of humanizing those who are often dehumanized by the penal system. Behind every number in a prison cell, she said, there is a life, a story, a family. We can't allow the system to forget that, thanks to his determination, several initiatives have been implemented, including rehabilitation programs for former prisoners and mandatory training for police officers and prosecutors on unconscious bias. A national campaign called Justice for All has been launched, with the aim of educating the public about their rights and the workings of the judicial system. The social impact of Emily's work was not limited to her country's borders. His story has crossed oceans, inspiring movements in other parts of the world. International human rights organizations have begun to use her case as an example in their own campaigns for justice and equality. Despite the changes, Emily has never lost sight of the individual stories behind each fight for justice. During a community event, she met a young woman named Rachel who had lost a brother to police violence. "I can't bring my brother back," Rachel said with tears in her eyes, "but seeing you fight gives me hope that other families won't have to go through the same." These encounters strengthened Emily's resolve. For her, every life touched, every voice amplified, was a victory on the way to a fairer system. Emily's journey has demonstrated that social transformation does not happen overnight, but rather through continuous and courageous efforts. She knew that the changes she helped implement would take time to produce lasting results, but she was willing to keep fighting. Reforms are not just about laws, Emily said in one of her last lectures. They are about changing hearts and minds, about building a society that values the truth and the dignity of every person. As Emily looked out the window of her new home, watching the sunset tint the sky with golden and pink hues, she reflected on the path she had traveled. From prisoner sentenced to the electric chair to a central figure in the fight for justice, her journey was marked by pain, resilience, and, above all, faith. Every step she took, every obstacle she faced, contributed to shaping her, not only as a survivor, but as an agent of transformation. She knew that her story was not unique. She was one of many voices that had been silenced for too long. Now, Emily was determined to continue using her freedom to amplify those voices, getting her message to everyone who needed to hear her. In her last public appearance before taking a break to focus on her personal life, Emily took the stage of a large auditorium. The audience was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds, all attracted by her story of overcoming. "When I was sentenced," she began, her voice firm but full of emotion, "I believed that my life was over. Every door seemed closed, every hope seemed lost. But God, in His infinite wisdom, has shown me that even in the deepest darkness, there is light." Emily paused, allowing her words to resonate in the room. "Today, I am here as living proof that the truth always finds its way." My journey was not just about personal justice, but about fighting for a more just and compassionate world. We all have a role to play in this effort. She then addressed the audience directly, with a heartfelt plea. Never underestimate the power of a voice, even when it seems small. Never doubt your ability to make a difference, no matter how difficult the circumstances. If my story can teach anything, it's that faith and determination can move mountains. The auditorium erupted in applause. Many were visibly moved, touched by Emily's strength and authenticity. In the crowd, Charlotte, now a child full of life and curiosity, smiled at her mother, knowing that this moment represented something much bigger than the two of them. Emily concluded her speech with a prayer of gratitude and a pledge to continue fighting for truth and justice. When she stepped down from the stage, she was surrounded by people who wanted to express their admiration and share how her words had impacted their lives. But for Emily, the real success wasn't in the lights or the applause. He was in the small moments, in the silent gestures of kindness, and in the transforming power of faith. She knew that her mission would not end there, but she was happy to know that she had inspired many to follow the same path. In the following days, Emily opted for a period of tranquility, dedicating herself to her family and local projects. Her home became a haven of love and hope, where Charlotte grew up surrounded by stories of courage and perseverance. Emily continued writing, sharing her reflections in a new book, which would be released the following year. His words would reach even more people, reinforcing the message that even in the most difficult circumstances, it is possible to find light and purpose. As she watched Charlotte play in the garden, Emily felt a deep peace. She knew the fight for justice and truth would continue, but for now, she was exactly where she needed to be, surrounded by love, faith, and the promise of a bright future. Emily returned to center stage with a serene smile and eyes that reflected the strength of someone who had overcome the impossible. With a firm voice, but full of emotion, she looked at the audience and said, "This story shows us that truth and faith have the power to transform lives. May we never lose hope, even when all seems lost. Remember, your voice has power, your story matters, and your faith can move mountains." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to touch each person present. "Now, I want to hear from you. If this story has touched your heart, please share this video with those who need inspiration.